Alright, I'm back. I'm gonna try to keep this one brief since I think I just set a record with my last one, but I try to do at least about an hour and a half of content a week for the class, uh, which is less than we would be meeting for normally. But I don't usually lecture for the entire 3 hours that we're that we're meeting. Although maybe I do, I don't even know. It's easier to go on and on when you have the back and forth with the students, and I so very much miss meeting you guys. This was such a nice class, such a good group of people, a lot of personality, a lot of the humor and enthusiasm. I really there's so much that's easy to think. So many reasons to feel pessimistic about life these days. This seems small in comparison to the amount of human suffering that's occurred since we last met, but all the same, I would have rather taught this class in person. And I've told a couple of you, but I won a fellowship for next year from a thing called the American Council of Learned Societies, and I won't be teaching at all next year. Um, so it's a much needed break for me to work on some writing, and hopefully when I get back to teaching it will be in person, because that's really where I thrive as a teacher. All right, so going back to the book, we're going to look at two passages. One for kind of didactic reasons, meaning for the purposes of kind of instructing you about these debates in the community of analysts and how to approach patients. And you might also think about this as debates in the community of critics and how we write about subjects. Do we maintain a cold, neutral, kind of rigorous attitude towards what we discuss, or are we involved? Do we have feelings? Are we being human? Are we seeing them as human? That is flawed and so on, and being commonsensical in approaching the material that we write about as critics. And in the book, these two schools of thought are associated with these two different analysts who are older than Green, and Green tends to side with Brenner, and you can kind of see that Malcolm's, at least in her sympathies and who she presents as primary, she's more sympathetic to Stone. Okay, so let's just read through what she says about Stone, because it's a wonderful summary, and I think the more I teach writing, the more I write myself. God, if summary isn't just the nuts and bolts, the fundamentals, the mid-range jump shot of being a critic and a writer. The thing, if you don't have it, if you can't do that, well, you can't play in the game. So, and she does it remarkably well. So let's look at this part. I'm on page 41. It's a long paragraph, and I'll start in the sentence a few years later. So Leo Stone is this guy, and he takes a humanistic view of the analytic relationship. Humanism meaning, I think I've maybe discussed that word with you guys. The idea being, humanists are people who think we can use reason and our own efforts to make the world better. And the American Humanist Association, one of the groups that's a humanist organization in the United States, their slogan is "Good without God." So it was historically in early modernity, it was a movement that was secularizing. It was like we're not going to discuss religious controversies and dogmas, beliefs, fixed beliefs of religious sects and all this stuff. We're just gonna worry about what we can know through evidence, through observation, and how we can use the information we gain that way to become to make our world better, to make more people have the possibility of happiness, to expand rights, to oppress groups, etc., etc., etc. So humanism in psychology is sort of almost anti-Freudian initially. It's a little bit warmer and fuzzier, and then there's an attempt by people like Stone to kind of incorporate humanistic conceits into the more classical Freudian style, which is, as you saw with Freud's analysis of Dora, he can be cruel. He can be not very understanding, not very sympathetic to his patients, who were often young women in really fragile emotional, psychological states, where you would, as a normal human being, aka a humanist, be, the natural reaction, unless you're a psychopath or a sociopath, would be empathy or sympathy. Like, are you okay? I'm so sorry you feel bad. Like that sort of thing. Okay? Freud's like, I thought you liked that guy. Like, why wouldn't you hook up with him? Okay. A few years later, Stone was to elaborate his view, this humanistic view about analysis. How can analysis be reformed to be more empathetic, to be more moral, to be less impossible, maybe? In a classic study of the psychoanalytic situation. At the symposium, he was content to simply express his fear that analysts' overzealous playing of their roles as silent, ungratifying, unknowable beings might subvert the very process that was intended to set it in motion. That is, if to never tell the patient, like, where you go on vacation, the name of your wife. You see someone for years on a weekly or more frequently than that basis, tell them everything you know, everything about yourself, pour your guts out, and they sit there coldly, never even telling you, like, the name of their pet or anything about themselves, okay? And Stone was saying this is undermining. Early in the paper, Stone reveals the sort of person, an analyst, he is, as he looks with a kind of sorrowing wonder at the flourishing psychoanalytic scene of New York in the 1950s. Today, wistfully referred to as the heyday of psychoanalysis, when scarcely any human problem admits of solution other than psychoanalysis. Stone goes on to ruefully note that by the same token, there is an almost magical expectation of help from the method, which does it grave injustice. Hopeless or grave reality situations, lack of talent or ability, usually regarded as inhibition, lack of an adequate philosophy of life, and almost any chronic physical illness may be brought to analysis for cure. What Stone finds most disquieting about this overestimation of its implicit loss of a sense of proportion about the human condition, a forgetting or denial of the fact that few human beings are without some troubles, and that many must be met, if at all, by old-fashioned methods, courage, or wisdom, or struggle, for instance. Also, that few people avoid altogether and forever some physical ailments, not to speak of the fact that all die of illness in the end. This is a wonderful quote. Wonderful quote. Sorry, getting the text. Stone goes so far as to offer the startling suggestion that if a man is otherwise happy, healthy, and efficient, and his rare attacks of headache can be avoided by not eating lobster, for example, it would seem better that he avoid eating lobster than that he be analyzed. Okay, so he's just, in a way, he's asking for something people never accused Freud of, never enjoyed a reputation for: modesty. Be modest. Not everything can be solved by this method of psychoanalysis. Going on. In the psychoanalytic situation, Stone argues for the necessity of framing the stormy, primitive drama of transference and countertransference in a placid relationship of two adults. One, a doctor of manifest goodwill and reliability, the other a patient of comparable maturity and responsibility, insofar as he comes to the sessions, pays the bills, and takes the analyst's unconventional behavior as a technical instrumentality rather than as a personal attack. Within the transference, of course, the patient may, and almost invariably does, wallow in his sense of injury and deprivation, rejection and outrage. Again, imagine falling in love with your analyst and the analyst rejecting you. Imagine feeling sort of like a lot of people feel about maybe their father in analysis, hating them or feeling ambivalent, feeling their, when you get to adolescence, they ask too many questions, they want to know your business and you want to be left alone, that kind of thing. Reliving those feelings. But a part of him should always know that these feelings are not to be altogether trusted. This capacity of the patient for detachment and self-observation, Stone characterizes as a benign split of the ego in observing and experiencing parts, which he considers essential for the work of the analytic process. His concern is that the analyst's unrelenting analytic behavior may subvert the process by shaking the faith of the patient's observing ego in the analyst's benignity, that is his goodwill, and tipping the balance in favor of the experiencing ego's delusion of malevolence. That is, if you're too like this, if you're too cold, too neutral, too rigorous in denying the patient any information about yourself and seeming human, you will hurt their ability to trust you. And tip the balance again in favor of the experiencing ego's delusion of malevolence. Malevolence meaning ill will. The sense that the analyst isn't trying to help you; they're actually trying to hurt you, and they're evil. Okay. Whereas purely technical and intellectual errors can, in most instances, be corrected, a failure in the critical juncture to show the reasonable human response, which any person inevitably expects from another on whom he deeply depends, can invalidate years of patient and largely skillful work, he writes. In wry protest against the over-literal and trivializing application of Freud's mirror principle, that is, just show them a mirror, don't show them yourself. Stone remarks, I doubt that the evolution of the transference neurosis is often seriously disturbed by the patient's knowing whether one takes, as the analyst, takes one's vacation in Vermont or Maine, or indeed, let me be so bold, that one knows something about sailing, knows more about sailing than golf. This really shows the class, the general social class, economic class, political class of analysts and patients, their upper class, bourgeois. And he adds, I think that it is not seldom disturbed by a persistent and repetitive, arbitrary refusal to answer such questions. After sufficient speculative fantasy, if there is no more specific or adequate reason than a general principle that the patient must not know anything about one, or that the analyst does not answer questions. Kohut puts the matter very succinctly in a footnote in his book, The Analysis of the Self, when he says, to remain silent when one is asked a question is not neutral, but rude. Stone mordantly notes, mordant being like funny in a kind of dry, cruel way, like he's satirizing his own colleagues here. The enthusiastic and engaging assertion of an older colleague many years ago that his patients would have developed the same vivid transference love towards him if he had been a brass monkey is, alas, not the drink, the popular drink in hip hop culture, but the just like a literal brass monkey, like a child's toy, a keepsake, is, alas, or perhaps fortunately, just not true. For all patients, to a degree that they are removed from the psychotic, have an important investment in their real and objective perceptions, and I gotta get rid of this. Okay. In their vivid perceptions, have an important investment in their real objective perceptions, and in the interplay between these and the transference requires a certain minimal, if variable, resemblance. For all patients, to the degree that they are removed from the psychotic, that is, are participating in reality and not just completely lost in a fantasy, have an important investment in their real and objective perceptions. And the interplay between these and the transference requires a certain minimal, if variable, resemblance from the analyst. To this delicate disentanglement of the strands of the transference from those of the real relationship, Stone adds a complication of a kind of meta-transference, which he calls the primary transference or the primordial transference. This has to do with the unconscious meaning that the patient attaches to the psychoanalytic situation itself, not the analyst, but just going there and agreeing to do this at all, which derives Stone hypothesis from his craving for an omnipotent parent of early infancy. This craving is universal and can be achieved by doctors, politicians, clergymen, and teachers, as well as analysts. Stone draws an interesting and, for his argument, telling distinction between the meaning of the primary transference generated by the physician and that generated by the analyst. While the physician's direct physical and emotional administrations correspond to those of the omniscient, omnipotent, and unintelligible mother of those periods of infancy, the analyst's activities resemble, in unconscious reverberation, the not-so-agreeable ones of the mother in the months when the infant is learning to talk and separate. That period of life when all the modalities of body intimacy and direct dependence on the mother are being relinquished or attenuated, para passu, from the rapid development of the great vehicle of communication by speech. It is this state of intimate separation or deprivation in intimacy that analysis is conducted, derived its mutative power from the tension between verbal closeness and emotional distance. Stone believes, however, that the early gratifying mother must not totally eclipsed by the latter, frustrating one. That the analyst's physicianly vocation must meld with his analytic one if the analytic process is to develop and flourish. And then she goes on to cite. So this is, you got to be that cruel mother that's saying, you're not sucking on my breasts anymore. You got to use your words. You got to poop in the toilet, etc., etc. That transference, but you also still have to be the caring early mother that is the sole basis of nutrition and everything. The pre-verbal, that early childhood mother. And then if you look at the bottom of the page, and I'll just read on here for a minute, and then we'll look at one very funny part, hopefully at the end, where she talks to Green, kind of like an analyst, and we can decide whether she's being the humanistic kind or the cold, neutral one. I think she finds a nice balance as again, like a reporter who's interviewing a subject, that there's an analogy there with the analyst listening to a patient's problems. I'm at bottom of 44 now, skipping a paragraph. Stone's attractive humanistic view of the analyst's role is currently shared by all but a small minority of analysts. So there's still this minority, and Green is part of this Brenner style. The leader of the opposition is Charles Brenner. Brenner has none of Stone's elegance of expression and incandescence of literary persona, but he is a worthy foeman. So he's not as good a writer, but he's got a point and he makes it well. His austere position has an icy beauty. In an article entitled "Working Alliance, Therapeutic Alliance, and Transference," Brenner challenged the whole notion that transference and the real relationship can be separated. Therapeutic alliance and working alliance are terms coined by the late Elizabeth Zetzel and the late Ralph Grenson, respectively, to denote the positive adult relationship in which transference is framed. To Brenner, all such separating and framing is suspect. He thinks the working alliance or the therapeutic alliance as a kind of shady side deal the analyst offers the patient to gain his compliance. A deal that looks kindly and humane on the surface, but in fact robs the patient of the full use of the analytic instrumentality. Because if you are at all friendly with someone, you're less likely, according to this, to be your honest, true self the way you will be with your psychoanalyst, where you can count on them not needing to be your friend, not needing to please them or entertain them or anything, okay? The way you have to, at least, to maintain most friendships. Suppose, Brenner asks here, suppose an analyst were to fall asleep during a session or to forget an appointment with the patient. Should he apologize, explain, discuss the reasons for his action with the patient? Brenner asks in his book, Psychoanalytic Technique and Psychic Conflict. He gives a rather magnificent answer. Again, a normal human being would apologize for missing an appointment. They would apologize for falling asleep while you're talking. Many analysts would say he should, and their arguments for doing so are persuasive. Yet I believe the better course to follow is the usual one of encouraging the patient to express his thoughts and feelings about what has happened. Excuse me. Only in that way can one learn whether a patient has taken his analyst's mistake as a slight that has offended and angered him, or as a sign of weakness that allows him to feel superior and even triumphant, or as a welcome excuse for anger. A conscientious analyst will naturally regret such a mistake. He will try, certainly though, through self-analysis to discover his unconscious reasons for having acted as he did, but he will be well advised to maintain an analytic attitude even to such an event as missing an appointment, and not to assume that it must mean that his patient without hearing what his patient has to say. So rather than apologize, to say, how does it make you feel? Don't admit, don't reveal, don't show your cards, don't act human. It is presumptuous to act the analyst unbidden in a social or family situation. Is a technical lapse to be other than an analyst in one's relationship with the analytic patient. Several years ago, Brenner and Stone, and then here you see the back and forth, the kind of synthesis. So they got together and had a debate, jointly led a seminar at the Institute in which they in such nice points of technique were debated. Should the analyst express sympathy to the patient whose father has just died? I mentioned this in one of the previous lectures. Was one question put to the leaders. Stone said that he, of course, would express sympathy. Brenner said that he, of course, wouldn't. Recently recalling this incident, a younger woman analyst of somewhat romantic leans declared, Charlie is a very kind man, that is Brenner. He might not say anything to the patient, but I'm sure he would let him know somehow, probably with his eyes, how sorry he was. She had missed Brenner's point. In the Working Alliance article, Brenner returns to this eventuality and gives this unexpected and unarguable reason for analytic neutrality, even in the face of death. So don't say to the guy, I'm sorry you fought to die. It is true that it often does no harm for an analyst to be thus conventionally human. Still, there are times when his being human under such circumstances can be harmful, and one cannot always know in advance when those times will be. As an example, for an analyst to express sympathy for a patient who has just lost a close relative may make it more difficult than it would otherwise be for the patient to express pleasure or spite or exhibitionist satisfaction over the loss. Some people are happy when close loved ones die, and they can't express that. They repress it, and then they get sick. They can't grieve. They're melancholy, and they need an analyst to tell that to. But here's what she says, and you see her sort of sympathies with this position, but also she really kind of almost gives him the last word. This is taking respect for individual experience and generosity of spirit toward human frailty very far indeed. So here we are at the limits of a certain kind of human relationship, where to give someone the absolute freedom to speak freely, you have to be, according to Brenner, cold, neutral, inhuman towards them. Let's look at one other passage. This is very funny. This is, again, her being the analyst towards Green, the main character, this sort of middle-aged, sort of anonymous, probably relatively mediocre psychoanalyst, successful guy, but he's not one of these leader guys. He's definitely no Freud in the movement. And he's discussing how he's gotten better. Psychoanalysis has helped him. He's gone into it. All analysts are required to go to therapy. That's Freud's recommendation. And he's despite that, developed new neuroses and so on. And he's talking about his anxiety about public speaking. And she shoots back skeptically. She says, but is that such a serious flaw? Is it even a symptom to be anxious about speaking publicly? Don't we all have something we don't do well or can't do at all? This is her asking him. I'm on page 57, top of the page. Page 57. My immediate reaction is to say, and this is Green now, look, if I'm going to have a flaw, let it be in an area that doesn't interfere with my professional ambition, which of course is nonsensical, since ambition is the problem. Right. There's no question about it. Ambition is the problem. But I think you'd be surprised by what the ambition is about. It isn't just about getting out there and killing my father. That's the ambition in the Freudian world goes back to this impossible early childhood ambition to kill your father in the Oedipus complex and sleep with your mother, etc. Um, that's that's just part of it. There are other things too. Well, I'll be frank. It's the desire to be a beautiful woman. You find you find all kinds of surprises in analysis. Somehow, that doesn't surprise me about you. I was interested to hear myself say, "Well, it surprised me. It bothered me. I can tell you." So he's like, it's so fun. He admits to her that one of his unconscious impulses is not only to kill his father, but not just to possess his mother, but to become his mother, to be a beautiful woman. And then she, of course, says to him, "That doesn't surprise me about you. I was interested to hear myself say," as though she's having a countertransference there. She's catching herself breaking her neutrality, and she becomes like unconsciously speaking and then becoming aware, like, "Oh my God, I just betrayed myself," and said to him, like, "Yeah, I can see how you would want to be a beautiful woman. This kind of ugly middle-aged dude wants to be a beautiful woman," and she's not at all surprised by that. Why? Well, for the obvious reason that he's like many beautiful women, he's exhibiting himself to her. He seems to enjoy talking to her and revealing things about himself the way people are beautiful often are. Embrace that about themselves and learn to enjoy the attention that they get for being so beautiful. But it's a very funny moment where her countertransference seems to emerge, her kind of bemused contempt for him and her skepticism for the enterprise, and he goes back to that idea that is journalism is the kind of interviewing and then reporting, basically snitching people out and manipulating it to make a story out of it and everything. Is it a morally defensible position to be in? And Malcolm famously in her other book, The Journalist and the Murderer, she answers no, it is not, because you got to make shit up to make the story interesting. All right, I'll leave it there. Try to finish the book for next week. And, stay safe out there in the crisis. I may try to organize a optional meeting on the live system we have, Blackboard Collaborate, for next week. Alrighty, so have a good week. Please turn in your Balzac essay. Please turn in your Benjamin essay. And if you would like to replace those ones with another one, with the final, I'll have the exam questions on Blackboard and sent to your email by the end of the week. Okay, have a good night. Stay safe. And power to the people.